properly. Good evening, gentlemen. Good evening. Tonight, God willing, we are going to be. It's the table that's wobbly. It's not the device. The table has gone wobbly, gentlemen.
Okay, I'm gonna put something in there. Yeah, you have to see which one it is. No, it's not. It's just.
It's at the top, yeah.
It's wobbly. It's wobbly.
Israeli on the left.
This evening, God willing, we are starting the 6th chapter, with the help of God, of Shaar HaYichud of the second part of Tanya. What have we learned so far, right? 6 chapters, halfway. It's halfway. There's 12 chapters in Shaar HaYichud 6 chapters, halfway. It doesn't mean halfway in length. Maybe it gets much harder at the end. I have to spend way more time. But long story short, chapter-wise is halfway. What have we learned in the first 5 chapters, right? Let's summarize briefly, shall we? Chapter 1, the Alter Rebbe teaches in the name of the Baal Shem Tov that the world is created constantly by God, right? The world is constantly sustained by the Word of God. This seems to be a remarkable teaching, but the full implications are not on display yet, right? The Alter Rebbe says very simply that God is constantly speaking the world into existence, that the divine speech from the 6 days of creation is still being spoken today. Chapter 2. And we mentioned already in chapter 1 that if he were to stop speaking, even for a moment, the world would absolutely return to nothingness. The same nothingness that was before was initially created, right? In an act of retroactive destruction, you may recall, from as we discussed in those classes. Chapter 2, the Alter Rebbe takes this idea and he says that the animal soul, the godly soul agrees that if the Baal Shem Tov says it, it's true, and if the Midrash Tillim says it, it's true. But the animal soul needs something a little more worldly. So we explain it philosophically as well, right? We take the same idea that God is constantly speaking the world into existence, and we show how it must be. Because the only way that a physical craftsman, right, can step away from his vessel, from his silver cup, if anyone remembers our favorite metaphor, the only way an earthly craftsman can create something and then step away from his creation, and the creation persists, is because the thing has its own existence from beforehand, right? The thing already exists. The silver is already there before the craftsman comes and he forms it, right? The craftsman is only bringing out a potential for a form that exists within the silver, as opposed to God, who creates everything absolutely new. He creates everything, something from nothing. We've had an upgrade, yeah? This is 2.0, Thursday night class 2.0 here. So God's way of creation is completely different from an earthly craftsman, and therefore he must constantly be involved in the act of creation, right? The world, by its very nature, by the very fact that it is created, something from nothing, right? The world shows that it needs God to constantly be involved in its creation. Just as we said in chapter 1, except demonstrated in a more philosophical manner. Chapter 3, we go further. We say, now that we see what it is that the world, that is creating the world, which is God's constant involvement, now we have to ask the question, what is the world now that it's here? Which is the real question of chapter 3, right? Chapter 1 and chapter 2 say that if God were to stop speaking the world into existence, it would totally cease to be, right? At any moment. Chapter 3 says, but now that he is speaking it into existence, what is it? And the conclusion of chapter 3 is that the world just is godliness. It has no reality at all apart from the godly power which is constantly creating it. Right? Just like the ray of the sun in the sun, right, which has no independent existence. All that is there is the sun. So too, the world is really not here as an independent reality. The world itself and everything that is created within the world is only an expression of the divine speech. All that is here is the divine speech. There is nothing here other than the godly expression, than God's light, than an expression of God. Chapter 4, right? In chapter 4, we ask the question, so then why do we not see? Right? Really the question at the end of chapter 3, but chapter 4 answers the question, I guess. So then why do we not see the godliness that's within everything? If the true reality of everything that exists is that it is only an expression of God, why does everything look so not godly and not an expression, right? Everything looks like it just sort of just is. Right? We don't have this experience of godliness in everything that we know and everything that we experience. Our self-experience is not of godliness, apparently. Our experience of the world around us is not of godliness, right? The table does not seem to be an expression at all. The table just seems to be an inert object, more or less, right? And the answer to the question is that God himself is hiding himself from us, right? The bottom line is that really there's two powers involved in the creation. There's two divine powers. There's two acts of God in creating the table, right? There is the divine self-revelation, which we call God's chesed, God's kindness, or Shem Havaya, right? Named by the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, right? Which is God's self-expression, his infinite kindness, which brings everything into existence from nothing into something at every moment. And then there is a second divine power, which is called by Shem Elokim, God's gvura, right? God's self-control, his self-concealment, his self-withholding, which is what conceals the truth of this reality from us, right? And in chapter 5, which is the last chapter we just finished, we elaborated on the particulars. It was a chapter of almost a parenthetical chapter. In fact, literally, according to the Rebbe's understanding, the whole chapter is included in parentheses, right? And the parenthetical chapter was about the particulars of this system, right? As we went into it, and I know that some of it was quite difficult and challenging stuff in the details, because we know that it's not that there's a divine power, Shem Havaya, which creates everything, and then a Shem Elokim, which conceals it, but rather these two powers are interwoven and work together in one motion, right? In a dark light. Right, as we called it, the butzina de kardunissa. It comes from the dark light. There's an expression of God, but the expression itself is concealed. It is a self-concealing expression, right? And all of the details that we went through about how is that possible, what does that mean, what about tzaddikim, what about the souls in Gan Eden, all of those, all the ramifications of that idea that the tzimtzum, that the concealment of God, that gvura, Elokim, is not just a second action, is not just a subtractive process which takes away from what Havaya creates, but is rather a, so to speak, a partner. The two actions are really working together. The two divine modes of expression and self-withholding are working together in the act of creation, that it's Shem Havaya that's creating, but because it does it through Elokim, the Havaya appears to not even be present as it does it. Right? So because of all of that working together, we had many ramifications and many questions that we went through, which is what chapter 5 was. Okay? So that's chapters 1 through 5, the briefest of summaries. Right? That's where we're holding. Chapter 6 goes deeper. Chapter 6 takes it deeper. Now that we have established that there is a Shem Havaya, there's a divine self-expression, and there's also a Shem Elokim, a divine power of self-concealment, right? And we know that they work together to create the world and assist in a system of light in vessel, right? Which was just a Kabbalistic way of saying that Havaya and Elokim are simultaneous and they form each other, right? Just like the letters form the divine speech, right? As we've been over. Now that we have that idea, we need to go deeper into the concept of Gevura, into the concept of this divine withholding. And what we're going to find, the goal of the chapter, the goal moving forward, right? And this chapter 7 is a whole new thing. In a way, chapter 6, in a way, the book is broken into two halves. Chapter 6 is really the capstone on the first half, and the second half is a whole new working at a whole new level. But the bottom line is, the gist, the direction that we're trying to go, is we are going to show how the fact that there are two divine powers, right, the act of self-revelation and the act of self-concealment, right, are not contradictions to the divine unity. That despite the fact that there is what we would call philosophically a dialectic, despite the fact that there are two powers that appear to be playing off of one another, right? God forbid to say that we have a religion that believes in two things rather than one thing. Right? The point of chapter 6 is that even though you need Shem Havaya to explain how anything is here at all, and you need Shem Elokim to explain how we don't experience godliness in everything that is here, ultimately these two powers are not two powers. Ultimately these two powers are both expressions of the one God. They're two sides of the same coin. They're totally unified. And that's really what we're working towards now, which, as you can see, it's like the crescendo, it's the climax, it's the grand finale of this whole idea. First we explain how everything is godly, but then we have to go back and we have to wrestle with our experience of everything as non-godly, right? Which is explained by Shem Elokim. And the conclusion is that the experience and the reality are not opposites. The experience and the reality are really one. Even though they seem to be, on the face of it, two completely opposite, diametrically opposed things, beneath the disparity, there is a unity. And that's what we're working towards now in our process of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah. And of course, to go even back further, right? Sof ma'aseh b'machshava tchila, not tchilosan b'soifan. The end is always connected to the beginning, right? The introduction to the Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, where we learned why we're even studying this book, right, was all about how we can learn and internalize the ideas that will help us come to a love of God, right? And the unity of God is a fundamental part of the love of God. It is appreciating how disparity comes from God's unity and a world of multiplicity comes from His oneness, and that His oneness is not affected despite the fact that He is totally involved in the multiplicity of the world, in the many different creations of the world. That is one of the fundamental bases of love of God. So we are working also not just intellectually, we are working forward also in our avodah goal, right? In our ability to worship God, which is really, really, really the purpose of all of this, right? This is to bring us to a greater worship of the divine. So that's where we're holding. Hopefully that helps situate everyone with what we're doing, in case we got lost in the weeds and in all the details, especially in chapter 5, which was a bit of rough going. We can now sort of refresh and zoom out and realize that we're not lost. It was just a lot of details, right? Okay. Let's begin chapter 6. We have the Hebrew in the front here, and we have the English. I actually think that for once I figured out how to get the English copies to go in the perfectly normal order. They just go one page to the next like a book, it's the real miracle. It's the real miracle it's the real revelation of Shem Havaya here in our own class. Oh, I should mention that tonight is Chav Teves. It's the Rambam's Yortzeit as well, just everyone should know. It was always a big day for the Rebbe. The Rebbe would always talk about the Rambam's Yortzeit. We can learn in honor of the Rambam.
So whoever does three chapters a day starts again this today?
I don't think so. Not positive? Don't think so. Don't know. Don't do 3 chapters.
3 chapters doesn't finish it in 1 year?
I do finish it in 1 year. I'm not sure if it's always on Chav Teves. I can't remember. I haven't attempted to do 3 chapters a day for many years. I don't know. Chav Teves. All right.
Is the Yortzeit of the Alter Rebbe?
Chav Daled. Chapter 6. V'hine. Parak Vav. V'hine. Behold.
Before you start with
Sorry, yes. Are there any questions I should ask before I start? It's a good
you
idea.
want to give us a summary of what we're headed into
A summary of what we're headed into.
in chapter 6.
What do you mean? I just told you. We are heading towards a deeper understanding of the unity of God through understanding Gvura better, through understanding Shem Elokim and God's self-concealment better. We're going to arrive at a deeper understanding of how God's self-concealment and God's self-revelation are not contradictory. They're two expressions of one God, and how that may be possible. Some ideas as to how that may be possible. And that's what we're heading into for chapter 6. V'hine. Behold. Shem Elokim, Hu Shem Midas HaGvura VaHatzimtzum. We are on page 892, right at the beginning. The name of Elokim, the divine name of Elokim, is the trait of Gvura, what I've been translating as severity, or the divine strength of self-withholding, VaHatzimtzum, and the contraction of the light, right? The limitation of the light, which we went into in chapter 4. We went into more details about how this is a limitation, not just in the amount of the light, right, but also in the form of the light, the way that the light expresses, right? We said that tzimtzum doesn't just make it that we can't see the water, right? It makes it that the water appears red, right? It adds traits to the water. So contraction is just somewhat of a misleading term, at least in this context, right? It's not a pure contraction. It also gives form, gives nature, right? Imparts things to Shem Havaya, which is part of our whole discussion at the end of chapter 4. I'm just reminding everyone, this shouldn't be...
Is that not more of a focus?
It's not focus is the wrong term. It's not a focus. It's a concealment, but it's a concealment by addition, not by subtraction. That's the difference. It's not taking away the light. It's putting things into the light that weren't there already, so to speak. Right? It's taking the light which appears white and making it red, right? Like a maybe not like a focus, more like a filter, right? You put a red filter on the camera, it gives it a different color. And that's actually literally the metaphor, more or less, of the ramak, right? Of the water in the cup. Anyway, so Shem Elokim, we're basically just continuing. It's actually a continuation. If you look back to where the end parentheses was, all the way back in chapter 4, we're basically just continuing. It's like one paragraph with a huge parentheses that encompasses a whole chapter in between, right? We're basically just continuing what we read there. We started talking about Gvura, right? And we're just continuing what we said there. Elokim, Gvura, the divine self-concealment. Elokim is the name for the divine trait of self-concealment and contraction, the contraction of God's light, the limitation of his expression. V'lechein, therefore, hu gam kein begematria hateva. It shares a gematria, it shares a numerical value with the word hateva. Hateva means nature. Hateva means nature. Nature is the usual translation. So hateva and the divine name Elokim share a value. I believe it's 86 without a... Yeah, 86. They share a numerical value of 86. So Elokim, the divine name Elokim, the divine self-withholding, is related to nature. What's the connection? Right? We've already spoken about briefly how the expression of Shem Havaya is connected with miracles, right? We discussed this last chapter, actually, right? You remember we discussed about how the pure Havaya that's expressed in the world, the Havaya not affected by Shem Elokim, right, is the miracles and the tzaddikim, right? So the miracles we know are connected with Shem Havaya. Nature, and the course of nature we're now learning is connected with Shem Elokim. What's nature? What's Teva? Teva is very interesting. There's a whole discussion in Chassidus of what Teva is, right? I have myself here, I have 4 opinions brought in Chassidus of what Teva means. The word. What does the word mean? We translate as nature. But the truth is that, what? No, also very good. The
Coin also.
There's the we translate as nature, but the fact is that Teva is not an old word. The Chacham Tzvi, no relation. The Chacham Tzvi points out that there's no traditional use of the word Teva in Chazal. There's no Teva's a new word. By new we mean non-ancient, right?
So
the past couple thousand words.
It's not exist in the Chumash. It's not existent.
I'm not sure. I don't think so. You can look for it. I don't think so. The word Teva, the Chacham Tzvi, I rely on the Chacham Tzvi. I don't know, but I would be willing to bet from it because that's what the Chacham Tzvi thinks. And you don't get called the Chacham Tzvi for nothing, right?
Is it Teva Adam?
But this is
commentary. But that's later. It's later, I think. I don't think it's a verse.
I think it's Obs. I mean, one of those.
זה מדרש, אני חושב, אולי זה מדרש.
Red Bobs.
Okay, so it's a newer term, right? It's not as ancient as it could be. The Chacham Tzvi, Teva is the word.
Or is it letters abbreviating.
No, it's a word. It's not an acronym. It's a word. Teva. Tes, ves, ayin. So there's four definitions of this term in Chassidus that I know of, anyway. One definition of teva, which is actually brought from the Chacham Tzvi, who makes the above-mentioned point that it's a newer word. The Chacham Tzvi says teva is just a name for something that happens over and over again. Constancy, something that happens all the time, right? The Chacham Tzvi famously says that everything is a divine act, right? But the divine acts that happen over and over and over again is what we call teva. It's a word that was conceived of to describe the divine acts that happen over and over and over again, right? Fundamentally, right, there's no, as the famous example goes, I think the Rebbe even mentioned it in letters, if I'm not mistaken, right? The famous example is that the sun rising in the west and setting in the east would be a tremendous miracle, right? The nature is that the sun rises in the east and sets to the west. Neither of them are at all possible without God doing it, right, is the fundamental point, right? In other words, what makes something a miracle is that it doesn't happen all the time. What makes something nature is that it's the way that God is making it happen all the time, right? And then in the context of this, you have to understand that it's not just everything is not miracles, right? The Chacham Tzvi is saying something deeper. The Chacham Tzvi is saying that there is actually a reality of teva. There is a reality of nature. It's not just miracles repeated over and over. There is a reality, there is something, God runs the world, right, in fundamentally two different ways. There is an inconstant way, right, with personal direct involvement. There is so to speak, and there is a constant way which is more set up as a system such that it runs constantly, and that's what we would call nature, even though both of them are acts of God.
So apparently, the word teva doesn't exist. Teva, it says atba'a, and it's in the Shmuel Aleph, it says vatitba ha'even b'mitzcho.
Maybe in David...
Could be something, but...
So it's not teva in the regular sense, right? Yeah, that's not in other words, the point is not that the every conjugation is new. In fact, on the contrary, we're going to define using all sorts of conjugations. The point is that teva, in the way we use it in the modern sense, meaning as nature, right, is not found, right? Okay. So there's a second way that Eyal mentioned. So one definition of teva, of the word teva, is constancy, something that happens consistently over and over again. There's a second definition of, pardon?
Repeatedly.
Yes, repeatedly. There's a second definition of teva, which is related to the word matbeya, right? Which itself is also a derivative word, right? Really, the teva, matbeya means coin. Teva, really, the root refers to the mold which makes the coin, right? The coin is made from a mold. You put a piece of metal in, and the mold is what makes the coin, right? So it says, I believe it's either in the Mishnah or the Gemara, I can't remember which, but it says that just as a mold makes the same coin over and over again, right, so too did God give man a nature, and man gives children to man, right? In other words, the idea that there are molds, that there are persistent forms, right, that go from one thing to its progeny, that there are, so to speak, copies of things, right, that there is such a thing as a species is one way of putting it. Right, that there is such a thing as a species is the idea of teva, like a mold making the same coin over and over again. So too did God do something called teva. What's teva? Teva is the repeated form, the repeated nature. Elephants give birth to elephants. Human beings give birth to human beings. Right, setting aside all of the objections from all of the people, which we don't have to deal with now. Chaim. The idea that there are consistent forms in nature is a different definition of teva. Then there is a third definition. The third definition, the Alter Rebbe actually says in Tanya, in the first part of Tanya, that teva is a nickname for everything that we don't understand. We call nature, right? In other words, if someone asks you, why do the birds fly south in the winter? Right? What's the answer? It's their nature. Yeah. Everything for which there's no that. In other words, when the answer is stam, that's the way it is because it is that way. Right? The answer is nature, which I hope you can see that so far these three definitions are all related one to the other, right? These are not different things, right? What makes a man, there's a person who gives birth to a person who gives birth to a person. That's constancy, right? It's also a form which is given one to the next, right? Or a bird gives birth to a bird which gives birth to a bird. So it's a consistent act. There's a consistency here. There's a shared form, right? And what is it that they are passing to the next one? What is what we would call in Yiddish birdkeit, right? Or in Yiddish, birdness. What is birdness that they are passing from one bird to the other, right? What is the quality of being a bird that is passed from one bird to the next, right? It's the thing that makes them a bird that has no explanation other than that's what makes them a bird. Right? In other words, the fact that the birth gives birth to a bird. How do I know that the second one is a bird? Because it's a bird, right? In other words, it has the nature of a bird. There's no explanation. The thing you can't explain, right? Because why can't you explain it? Not because we haven't discovered enough of the details about it, or the scientists haven't dug deeply enough into its makeup. That's not the point, right? The point is not that you would say that water flowed, you would say, or water is wet, right? Because we don't know, once we didn't know that it was H2O, now that we know it's H2O, right? Knowing that it's H2O, and even knowing the fluid dynamics of H2O and the way the chemicals work in H2O and all the other things that we know about water, right? None of that yet explains what it is that makes water itself wet, if you understand what I'm saying. It's a philosophical point, not a mechanical point, right? It's the nature of water as we experience it, that water is watery, right? It's something that it has be'etzem, we would say, something that it has essentially, right? That's another way of saying nature. What makes water wet? Because it's water, right? That's the sense in which the Alter Rebbe is saying it. Then there's a fourth meaning of the word teva, which there's tubu b'yamsuf, right? As we read in Az Yashir every day, right? That they were drowned in the sea. Uses the same letters. The Pharaoh's chariots, right? That were chasing after the Jewish people were drowned in the sea. Tubu b'yamsuf. Teva means submerged in water, which the classic Chassidic observation of observed in water, and this is why, by the way, the splitting of the sea is the arch miracle, right? It's the miracle that is the example of all miracles, because what it means to be submerged in water comes from a very simple empirical observation, which is that if I go outside on a clear night, not like tonight, but if I go outside on a clear night and I look up in the sky, right, the sun is the moon is millions of miles away, but I can see the moon clearly. But if I go to the ocean and I look out over the ocean, right, and there's a seashell 3 feet from my eyes, I can't see it, right? The water, what being submerged means in water is that there is a thin veneer, right, of water. It just takes a little water over the thing, and all of a sudden it becomes invisible, even though it's still there. And it's the same thing before you submerge it, right? If I take the seashell out of the water, it's the same seashell. The only difference is that when it's in the water, I can't see it. When it's out of the water, I can see it, which is why the splitting of the sea in the Kabbalistic understanding, in the Chassidic understanding, is the revealing what is hidden, right? It's making the water, what's submerged, into the dry land, which is the function of all miracles, right? The function of all miracles is to take whatever the nature appears to be and show that beneath the nature there is a God who controls and creates this thing, right? So beneath the nature, now we're getting circular, right? You're defining nature with nature. So if you put all of these definitions together, right? All together, you have nature, which is the same gematria as Elokim. What does Elokim accomplish? It says the world's godliness is concealed. How is the world's godliness concealed? The world's godliness is concealed by the consistency of the world, that things keep happening, right? It's concealed by repetition in the world, right? It's concealed by established forms, right? And it's concealed by the inexplicability of the world, that things just seem to be. right? That things just are, the just are-ness of a thing, right? Because the true answer to the question of why is water wet is not because it's water, it's because God makes it wet, is the real answer to the question, right? And you see how that aspect of Teva as well covers over God, because water just is, right? The very idea that the forms are, so to speak, self-contained, that water's nature is just to be, rather than something that is created, is itself a concealment of God. So all four of these definitions, right? If you put all of them together, you get a pretty robust idea of what it means in nature. And this nature is created by Shem Elokim. If you could see God, you would see that since everything is a direct action of God, there is no actual repetition, right? Because God is constantly recreating everything, always. In fact, the Rebbe says, in Kuntres Inyanos of Shaar HaYichud, which we should learn sometime, it's one of the Rebbe's famous sichos, one of the Rebbe's great incredible works. The Rebbe says there that the reason why when you wake up in the morning you tend to feel better than before you go to sleep at night, and your mood sort of goes down like this as the day goes on and on, is not just because you're getting more tired and more cranky, but because at the first moment of the morning when we're supposed to say Medani, and there is connecting it to the whole idea of Medani, but in the very first moment of the morning, the soul perceives just a little bit how everything is constantly recreated. Right? So the soul, in the morning, we have a little bit more attachment to the sense that really nothing is persistent. There is no constancy of nature, which means that I'm essentially much more free than I think I am. Right? I'm not weighed down by anything that happened in the past. Nothing that happened in the past defines the present, because the present is constantly recreated, right? Even nature is an act of God, which is being done constantly, right? So why should I worry about all the things that happened yesterday and all the things that happened before? It's a new world this morning. It's literally a brand new world, right? It's being constantly recreated. There's no true, from God's perspective, there's no persistency to the past, right? Everything, God is constantly making everything that's happened now happen right now. Yeah, right? And the same idea with repetition, that no two things are the same, and with the form, that we know that even though each and every human being seems to share a nature, right, or each and every bird seems to share a nature, we know that the existence of the father is not enough to ensure the existence of the child. The child has his own route to God. Right? It doesn't just go through his nature, right? Each and everything which is created has a unique, present, so to speak, totally, if you understand what, I don't know if what I'm saying is coming through clearly, a pure and unique relationship with God that is not defined by anything that came in the past, right? The nature does not define it. Right, and so too with the very fact that the nature is unexplained, right? You would see past. You would see that the nature that I have is something which comes from God. So, in other words, if Shem Elokim were revealed, if we saw that everything was a part of godliness, all these different things of nature would disappear. Each one of these different definitions of nature we would see does not really hold if we could see Shem Havaya. So therefore, these natures of things, these qualities that we've been describing, are created by the concealment of Shem Havaya, are created by the tzimtzum, by gvura, by God's concealment. And this fact is reflected in that the gematria of Elikim and the gematria of nature are the same. Right? That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. Let's read further. Lefi, I'm halfway down to 893. Lefi shemastir ha'or shalamayla. Why does Elokim share a numerical value with nature? Because it conceals the light above, hamahava u'mechaya ha'elam, which brings the world into existence and gives it its nature. Right, as we translate mahava u'mechaya. We may need a deeper definition soon, but that's what we'll stick with for now. And it seems that the world stands and misnaig is hard to translate, like behaves itself. It's reflexive, right? The world goes on its merry way, in the natural way, right? That's what Elokim does. Elokim makes the world seem that way. One second, sorry. Yeah, actually, this is a good time. Yeah.
The original Torah was written in what, Aramaic?
No, in Hebrew. The original Torah is the
Ancient Hebrew.
Yeah, correct. It's the same. So the words are the same. Words and letters are the same today.
Words and but the evolution of the language.
Yeah.
And the numbers associated.
Yes.
With words.
Yes.
That's to me that's important. numbers.
As far as I know, I don't know a lot about gematria. I know there may be some bigger experts in our synagogue. There's no, I don't know a lot about gematria. What I do know is that, as far as I know, the assigned numerical values of the letters is something very, very ancient. As ancient, at least, as the Torah itself. And the text of the Torah, right, is basically the same. What you're saying now is very interesting, which I hadn't even thought of, which is that if, as the Chacham Tzvi says, teva, nature, is really a newer word, right, it's interesting that there would be an applicable gematria. I don't know how that works out. That's a very interesting idea. More recent. Chacham Tzvi is a late Rishon or an early Achron, I believe. It's not medieval or after. So, if I'm not mistaken. So,
And then was anybody aware of the numerical significance of any?
well, the thing is, right, the thing is that there's a classic problem with gematrias. We don't really have time for this, but we'll talk about it anyway because it's so important.
Not just anybody can come.
There's no, the classical problem with gematrias and with numerical values is that really if you want, and if you really get into it, you'll see that people do, you can make anything say anything, pretty much, right? Once you reduce the letters to numbers, and numbers are so manipulable, right, it's endless, right? And then you can cheat, because sometimes the number can be one off, but they say it works anyway, because you can count the whole word as another number. It becomes a whole thing, right? It becomes like a game.
Even
right?
Donald Trump becomes Mashiach ben David.
Yeah, exactly. People made Donald Trump gematrias. I'm not a fan, I have to say. I wasn't a fan of the Donald Trump gematrias or the Hillary Clinton gematrias. I have to be.
She is the Malakia.
I'm not getting into it. It's not. The point is that it's not real. You can make it say whatever you want, right? So classically speaking, in Judaism, gematrias in the Talmud, in terms of Jewish law, the gematria is almost non-existent, right? Very, very rarely used. It's called, the Mishnah calls the gematria the parparois de chachma, which means it's like the spice of wisdom, right? You would never eat sriracha sauce as a meal. Right? Sriracha sauce is something that once you have the meal complete, you sprinkle it on to add a bit of, like a kick, right? The gematria is the same, to be used sparingly, right? In other words, once you have that the idea is fundamentally connected, you have two things that are connected anyway by some other line of reason. So the gematria adds it helps you remember, it adds a nice dimension, but nothing, as far as I know, nothing in Judaism stands on gematria alone. I don't know if there is such a thing.
It's about the Pardes, the remez.
I agree. No. I agree. Absolutely. I'm not.
I talk about them in the Bnei Israel. That Yaakov told them, "Redu Mitzrayim." They do redu.
Yeah. No.
It's mentioned a few times.
I agree. Rashi even mentions that there's some gematrias in Rashi. That's a gematria that's mentioned in Rashi, if I'm not mistaken. No. I'm not saying. God forbid. I'm not saying gematrias aren't a part of Torah. They're unimportant. All I'm saying is that almost everything in Judaism that's serious, that's being explained by gematria, is supported elsewhere, is supported by other things, and the gematria is adding. Is usually the way it is. For example, right, a very famous one from Purim time, as it says, you're supposed to get so drunk that you don't know the difference between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai. Cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai, and it happens to be that the two terms have the same gematria, right? Which shows you the depth of the right. It adds a whole new layer. But the meaning of the phrase was the same before. The gematria just shows you a deeper level of connection. That it's not just things that are being compared at the word level. They're also mathematically there's a connection. Right? Generally speaking, that's my understanding. I know that there's, Rav Shochad of blessed memory, Emmanuel Shochad, wrote a little sort of introduction to the idea of gematria and how gematria is used in Judaism. I'm not exactly sure where it's printed. Maybe I can find it and share it on the guys group if I remember. Maybe on Chabad.org. I'll try and find it.
Anyway, Chabad Tzvi was an Ashkenazi rabbi, and
Yeah.
after he went to Saloniki and learned in his Sephardic yeshiva, this is when he got to be a chacham.
That's very important for the class. When did he live?
In Hungary.
When?
Taf Kaf. Taf Kaf is
Taf Kuf.
Taf Kaf.
Taf Kaf.
Yes, 420. So.
Wow. That's a long time ago.
So.
Hey Taf Kaf.
It says Taf Kaf.
Yeah, it must be.
5,420.
נולד בסביבות שנת ת"כ, בטריבץ' שבמורביה. Never mind, sorry.
What's the secular date?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. What time is it?
350 שנה.
Okay.
350 years ago.
Let's read a little further. V'shem Elokim zeh. This name of Elokim, which is a strange thing to say, by the way, strange language, which we'll talk about in a second. Sorry, I'm on page 894, the first line. V'shem Elokim zeh, pardon me. This name, Elokim, Hu magen v'nartik l'shem havaya. He's summarizing, he's referring to what we said in chapter 4, is a shield and a sheath, right? For Shem Havaya, right? Remember we had the verse, Ki shemesh umagen Havaya Elokim, right? A sun and its shield is Havaya and Elokim, which we explained that there's the sun, right? What's the metaphor? The sun is the source of the radiance, the source of heat. But if the sun were just allowed to shine freely, it would burn up the world, right? The world would not be able to survive. So there's something that's over the sun, which so to speak, attenuates and reduces its light, right, such that the world isn't blown away by the power of the sun, right? This is the idea, right? So this Elokim is the nartik to Havaya, as we explained, right? Elokim is what is reducing the light of Havaya, right? This was actually the simple explanation at the beginning of chapter 4, before we started getting complicated about how the two of them work together, right? And it's and Kli, all of which is true, right? But this is so now we understand the depth of what it says. When it says that Elokim is like a shield over the sun, right? It doesn't mean that Elokim is just a separate power which just reduces Havaya. It means that Elokim affects Havaya. It's the way that Havaya expresses itself. It's not just a reducing shield. It is actually the means by which the light expresses itself, as we discussed at great length throughout the end of chapter 4 and all of chapter 5, etc. Why Shem Elokim Zeh, by the way? This Shem Elokim, right?
Well, there's many names.
It's this Shem Elokim. He doesn't just have many names, he has many Shem Elokims, is really what it's saying. Right? This Shem Elokim is the one that works with Havaya to create the world. And the Rebbe's father notes here, when the Rebbe's father has his notes on Tanya, one of the Rebbe's father's note here was that there's many things that are Shem Elokim. In other words, it's important in general, as we'll see in this chapter and the coming chapters, it's important in general to realize that, I may as well do my whole spiel on this now. It's important when learning Chassidus and Kabbalah to understand that when we're talking about the order of the worlds and the process of the world's creation, right? We're not talking about, and this is going to sound obvious, right? We're not talking about physical things. Now, I know you know that. You know that it's a spiritual thing. But what do I mean? Because it's very possible to think of spiritual things like physical things, even if you don't mean to, right? You know that Shem Havaya and Shem Elokim are spiritual, right? You know we're not talking about physical, right? Or I heard a mashpia say once, if you think that the light in vessels means that there's a huge lamp going into a pot, right? You're not really, you haven't really got it, right? You're thinking a little too physical, right? There isn't a lamp shining into a pot. That's not, whatever it is, that's not what it is, right? That for sure not. But the same idea, right? Of course, that's ridiculous to think that it's a lamp in a pot. But in more subtle ways, we do things that are less ridiculous with us all the time. Because really, we know when we're talking about Shem Havaya and Shem Elokim, when we say that these are two divine actions or two divine modes of expression, ways of being, right? We understand that what we're talking about is something much more subtle than what you could point your finger to on a map, right? We're not talking about things that are confined to a certain place, right? Or a certain, even intellectually, to a certain limited boundary. So let me explain to you what I mean. Right? We're talking here about God's chesed and gvura, right? We have God's kindness and God's severity, right? The bottom line is that these are not two things that appear one time in Chassidus and Kabbalah. They're not, what's the way of putting it?
Constantly.
It's not like chesed, right? is a piece of cloth that's white, and Gvura is a piece of cloth that's black. Chesed and Gvura are threads, and individual threads you can combine and rearrange to create all sorts of different things. You can create a cloth, you could create a curtain, you could create a hat, right? You could create clothes, right? In other words, Chesed and Gvura as divine modes of expression, what that means is that these are two different ways for God to do things. But of course, everything comes from God, right? So if there's two different divine ways of doing things, but there's an infinite number of things, that means that Chesed and Gvura express in many, many, many different ways, right? So let me tell you what I mean, right? They're almost like another way of thinking about them is like Russian dolls, right? Everything is nested one within the other. Let me give you an example. So Chesed, right? Chesed can mean many things. Chesed can mean many things. God's kindness. When I say God's kindness, what do I mean? Well, let's think, right? We could mean physical blessings in this world is absolutely an expression of God's kindness. But we now know, after studying 5 full chapters of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, right, that even if there's something that really bothers us, right, let's say a curse, not a blessing, right? Let's say I stub my toe, right? A curse, terrible. Right? The Gemara says that a Jew in this world doesn't hurt their finger without the Beis Din declaring it above that they deserve it. Right? God forbid that a Jew should even hurt their finger. Right? You hurt your finger, it means you deserve it. Right? Stam, you should know. It's a good Gemara to know. Anyway, so you stub your toe. Right? We know now, learning after 5 chapters of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, that even the things which are curses to us, right? It's only God's kindness which is constantly sustaining them in existence. Right? The physical existence of my toe and the physical existence of the table, right, which are necessary parts of the two of them colliding into this curse, right, are also created from God's kindness, right? So I have God's kindness as a blessing. I have God's kindness which is sustaining the things in existence, right? Then I have God's kindness as a sphira, right, as we refer to it in a spiritual sense. Chesed of Atzilus, right, the divine, one of the 10 divine modes of expression in the world of emanation, right, which we're going to talk about a lot more in the coming classes, God willing. You have Chesed of Atzilus, right, which is God's kindness. But the truth is that when we know about spheres, which we really already learned, we just didn't put it in these letters, right, we know that every sphera is itself made up of ur and kli, of light and vessel. So in the vessel of kindness, right, in the sphere of kindness, in God's kindness, as we speak about it in the most literal sense, what is God's kindness according to Chassidus? It's Chesed Atzilus. It's the emanation of God's kindness, God's light as it expresses through the vessel of God's kindness in the world of Atzilus. Right? It doesn't matter if you don't know what that means. The point is that within that God's kindness, right, that itself comes in halves. Right? There is a kli, there's a vessel, and there's a divine light. The divine light is also called God's chesed, right? So the light is the chesed part, but the vessel is the gvura part. So even within the kindness, you have half of it is kindness and half of it is the opposite of kindness, right? But the truth is that this light itself is also not undifferentiated. The light itself has spheres. As you get into the more advanced study of Chassidus, and the more advanced and the deeper things, the light itself, as it comes from the worlds before Atzilus, right, is affected by the tzimtzum, the original tzimtzum, and the original tzimtzum is gvura. Right? But the fact is that even the divine light before the tzimtzum, right? Even the divine light before God makes the initial contraction and removes his divine light, that divine light as well also has two aspects. There's the light as it expresses, and there's light as it is in its source, right? One of them is more chesed, one of them is more gvura, right? So what I'm saying is that chesed and gvura is a thing at every level. It's not one place. You can't say chesed just means chesed of Atzilus and you point to it on a map and that's chesed, right? Chesed is not the thing that is created. It's the thread by which the things are created. In Sfiras HaOlam, that's a different thing, that the Sfiras are all nichlal one in the other, right? That you have chesed of gvura and gvura of chesed, right? That's an even further complication, right? That none of the Sfiras as they are in our world are pure. Each one of them is included with all included with all the other ones, right? That even pure chesed is not pure chesed in our world, right? In other words, the point is that when we're talking, what? You do have chesed shebechesed, but even chesed shebechesed is part of a sfira in Atzilus, Atzilus, which has a Gvura aspect and comes after the Tzimtzum. Right? In other words, what I'm saying is there's no end. It's not
Fix something.
It's not like one battle, right? The Chesed and Gvura showdown, right? The rumble in the jungle. It happens in Atzilus, and that's it, right? That's not how it works at all, right? There's 10 divine modes of expression, and the 10 divine modes of expression are constantly interwoven and related and splitting apart and coming back together again, right? When they say that Kabbalah is very complicated and studying the Zohar has driven men mad, this may be part of what they're referring to, right? It's not so difficult. I don't know exactly what they mean, otherwise I wouldn't be here. I'd be in the funny farm, right? But I can imagine that something like this is part of it, right? Because it's all nested one within the other, right? And even it's not just Chesed and Gvura; it's everything that we're learning about, right? You find out after you learn enough Chassidus that what you've been calling Atzilus is really only the Atzilus of Asiya, that it's an Atzilus nested within another world, right? There's the 4 worlds are not just 4 worlds, right? There's cascading orders of worlds, right? Like a fractal, right? That you have within the world of Asiya, you have Atzilus Bria Yetzira Asiya. But then within that Atzilus you have, right, it's just it never ends, right? You have spiritual, you have physical, you have within the person you have all the worlds expressed as well, right? Each one of the worlds shines within the person as an individual reality. What I'm trying to tell you is when we're talking about these things, you have to open your mind a little bit. You have to understand that because otherwise it will drive you insane. Because you're always going to be saying, he just said this about chesed, but it's the opposite of the chesed, the thing about chesed that I learned last week, right? And the truth is that it all does make sense. It all is worked out into a system, but you have to understand what it's talking about. You have to be able to make these fine distinctions, right? And it's all about the distinctions. Understanding things, especially in Chassidus, right, is all about understanding the fine distinctions between things. You have to understand that Chesed of Atzilus is not the same as the of Chesed of Atzilus, as the light of Chesed of Atzilus, which is a different type of Chesed, it's a different mode of Chesed. So when the Alter Rebbe says the Shem Elokim Zeh, right, this Shem Elokim has this function, right, that's because the Rebbe's father was an actual master Kabbalist, and he knew all of Kabbalah, and he knows that you don't go around just saying Shem Elokim is this, Shem Elokim is that, right? You're talking about a specific type of thing. You're talking about Shem Elokim as we're describing it now. And this whole spiel that I'm telling you will actually become pertinent and relevant next week. I'm going to remind you of all this next week, God willing, because next week when we move forward to the next few words, we're going to start talking about how Gvura is mixed with Chesed and Chesed is mixed with Gvura, and we're going to get to some of the depth of why this is so important. By the way, this whole thing that I'm describing, the fact that everything is mixed with everything else, and Chesed exists at so many different levels, etc., right? The fact that such a thing is even possible, right, is what we call tikkun, is what we call order. God could have created the world in such a way that all of these powers were totally non-mixed, that there was just chesed, and there was just gvura, there was no interleaving, there was no chesed all over the place, and gvura all over the place, right? God could have created it differently. He created it in this way because this is the way of order. This is the way of finding the unity in all things, which, remember, is the theme of our chapter, right? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find how opposites are really not opposites, right? And this is part of what you need to understand to arrive at that conclusion. You have to, if you think that chesed is only one thing, then you'll never be able to see how chesed is not really opposed to gvura. Right? Once you realize that chesed is not one thing, but is really many things, and that if you could understand everything that chesed was, you would arrive at the conclusion that chesed is nothing other than God himself, and an expression of God himself. And if you did the same thing with gvura, you would arrive at the conclusion that gvura is nothing but an expression of God himself, and then you can see how chesed and gvura are really not opposites, because both of them are just expressions of God himself. But if you have a narrow-minded view, right, and you see chesed and gvura as just two distinct things, and they always just do the opposite, right? Then it's very, very hard, especially for a human mind, because as we're going to discuss, the tikkun isn't really in our world until the times of Mashiach. As we're going to discuss, this idea of unity is not really in the physical world until Mashiach comes. So for a human mind, it's very hard to appreciate how Chesed and Gvura are not opposites, how they can ever be united if you see them only as two things which are always doing the opposite thing. As we're going to start learning next week, Gvura is really, the Gvura that we're describing, the Shem Elikim that we're describing, is really itself just an expression of Chesed. It's really just an expression of Chesed. We're going to take this whole package, this whole complex notion of Havaya and Elikim together that we have coming out of chapter 4 and chapter 5, and we're going to show how even though we've made such a dividing line between Gvura and Chesed, that whole thing is nested within a Chesed system. In other words, the context of the Gvura that we're describing is purely a Chesed context, right? So the Gvura is really we're going to understand Gvura in a much deeper way. This Tzimtzum, this self-concealment of God, we're going to find out is really part and parcel, and one with the divine revelation. It's not a concealment at all, as we're going to see next week.
What if it's related to Mashiach?
When Mashiach comes,